DMT, dynamite. DMT, gonna win the fight. This episode is all about dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, with special guest Zeus Tipado. Zeus is currently researching the DMT trip and what is happening in our brains when we take DMT, using tools like virtual reality to get a better understanding of what's going on, and really cool brain probes. I met Zeus last year at a psychedelic conference and heard him speak about his research, which is wicked cool, but I also just love that Zeus has the persona of a psychedelic researcher, and I think that's absolutely rad. Thank you to the patrons who make this podcast possible. You can join this community for as little as $1 a month, ask guest questions ahead of time, chat with me in the DMs, and get some exclusive content. If you want a free and easy way to support this podcast, drop a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple. And hey, if you don't want to do anything, sit back, relax, unclench your jaw, and chill out with us for the next hour. I wear yellow sunglasses all the time. I love that.
Right? It's just a really decent vibe. I'm really into the yellow sunglasses.
Dude, me too.
Oh, also, and I have this. This is actually water, but I just have it to...
That's hilarious. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. It is a good water bottle.
So,
I feel like we should reuse it.
It's a great water bottle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sick. All right. So welcome back to the Bioactive Podcast. Today we have Zeus Tipado, and I'm going to let you do the full introduction of yourself, but you are doing some of the coolest research on DMT and the intersection of DMT and virtual reality. So I can't wait to talk about this and for you to teach the audience a little bit about what you're doing and kind of the direction of all of this research. So if you don't mind just giving a little background on, honestly, just like, it doesn't even need to be academic, just, why you got interested in this type of research, and then we'll go from there.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Zeus Tipado. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at Maastricht University, focusing on the brain and DMT and, of course, VR. And I'm looking at the brain via functional infrared spectroscopy. It's a way to really peer into the brain while it's processing things. And yeah, so why DMT? How did I get into DMT? Well, take DMT and you'll probably find out yourself, to be honest with you. It's a psychedelic that is unlike any other substance that I've ever seen or that I've ever experienced. It's guaranteed a visual trip. The trip is very eidactic, which is more real than real, even hyper complex. So yeah, I figured that it'd be great if we really see what's happening in the brain, specifically in the visual cortex, like the back of the brain, whenever a person takes DMT. And then why VR? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. We'll get into that a bit later.
Dude, would you mind kind of talking about what your first DMT experience was like? What the visuals might have been like, but also did you do it in a banger or a pen, or what was the actual consumption like? What was that experience like?
Yeah, so actually it was pretty wild. The first time I did DMT, my friends from Hong Kong, they flew all the way from Hong Kong to California, and they brought the DMT with them from Hong Kong.
That's so cool.
Which is awesome, yeah. And so at towards the end of their trip, they were like, yeah, we have to finish all of this DMT before we hop on the plane back to Hong Kong. And I'm like, okay, let's have a bit of a party. So I had DMT for the first time with about 6 other people I was the only person from California during this experience. We were in my living room on a Tuesday, some random Tuesday. And I did it via a vape, basically a portable dab rig.
Okay.
That they were sort of promoting, or not selling, but they were promoting. They came to America to promote this really dope device, and we packed it in there.
for DMT, or it's like a vape device for cannabis, but also used for DMT?
Yeah, well, it's for like concentrates and like
Okay.
extract. So
Okay.
yeah, it can be for cannabis, but also it can be for DMT because you could change the temperature, you can put it up to whatever you want, and it's a great little compartment. You throw your extract or DMT crystals in there, and so we put DMT crystals in there. And yeah, it was really interesting because we like timed it at the exact like perfect time. We all did it, we all hit it, and we all shared a very similar experience, which is pretty remarkable. So yeah, it was very alien, very weird. I haven't experienced anything like that. So from that point on, I'm like, what is really going down in the brain?
And you had done other psychedelics in the past, right? So you were able to kind of compare and contrast these experiences and be like, okay, DMT was a very unique experience. Like, let's explore that more.
Yeah, like absolutely. So I've definitely done other things before. I've done like LSD, like psilocybin many times, like MDMA, San Pedro, lots of other things. But it's really difficult to compare the DMT experience to any of those substances. I would say the closest substance you can sort of compare the DMT experience to is Salvia divinorum. Has anyone heard of Salvia divinorum? A very intense psychedelic that was actually sold like for like over the counter. Just like go to like a pet shop and buy one of the most powerful psychedelics like imaginable. I don't know what we were thinking in like America.
Dude, by weight, salvia is the most potent psychedelic, like by weight for especially a natural substance. And I agree. Like I remember being in high school and, I smoked weed in high school and then somebody bought salvia at a head shop and topped a bowl with salvia. And I was like, cool, like sounds like fun. Hit it, went to a different planet. And I was like, how is this legal to sell in head shops? Like that was wild to me.
It's a wild substance, yeah, and honestly, like we don't really understand a lot about it in science. Salvia divinorum, we understand that it operates. It's a kappa opioid receptor agonist, so it operates on kappa opioid receptors, and it's the only psychedelic that actually does. So yeah, it's pretty wild stuff.
Awesome. And one last question just about your experience. Did you find it was kind of an out-of-body experience, or were you still, capable of understanding where you were in time and space?
Oh, Riley. Things like bodies, things like physics, gravity, that's so insignificant in a DMT experience. It's you don't even think of those things. You think of different dynamics like the idea of even consciously thinking about something like that seems like almost an inferior thought because your thoughts are just with all types of fractal, infinite, whatever things, beings, buildings. You are that and you aren't that, then you're everything, then you're like nothing at the same time. And all this is happening. And you're like, what is, and I tell people like with DMT, you don't even have enough emotional energy to get like, to have like fear. Like fear doesn't even really exist because that's a very sort of, ridiculous concept, fear. It's like you're too busy processing other things to even accept fear. So yeah.
I love that answer. I've also done DMT and it's so hard to explain to people, but I feel like you do such a good job of being like, dude, you're not even in your brain. You're around your brain. You're in space. You're back down. It's so hard to explain, which I think is kind of part of the beauty of it, because it's kind of like, you kind of have to do it to experience it. Question for you. Our body produces DMT, right? Do we know why our body produces DMT? I know it's released when you have near-death experiences or dying. Do we have any sort of idea why?
Yeah, so our body does produce DMT for sure, but our body produces a lot of things, a lot of different substances. Like, for example, your eyes produce its own version of like cocaine and amphetamines. Like in your eyes right now, there's just cocaine and amphetamines floating around. And why? Well, we have theories, but so what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of things that are floating around in your body, and DMT definitely is one of those substances. Now, why is DMT in your body? To be fair, we really don't have a conclusive answer. It could be as simple as our bodies are just giant factories of chemicals that just produce all types of different combination of chemical substances, and one of these chemical substances happens to be DMT. And people say, yeah, it's released when we die. Yes, but there's a lot of different chemicals and different substances that are released when we die. There's a theory, I have a theory that actually says that the reason why DMT perhaps could be released when we die is because DMT has a very ischemic property, which basically says that so in the event of lack of oxygen, DMT has the ability to protect cells whenever we have an ischemic event, like a stroke or something. So perhaps that's the reason why DMT is released, to just protect our actual physical body and our physical sort of brain cells,
When it's specifically under stress with like a near-death experience or actually death, or maybe it could even be something else in other situations we're releasing DMT. That's really interesting. So DMT has kind of a neuroprotective effect in our brain. It could be thought of as a positive in protecting our brain.
Totally, yeah. And the reason why we even have discovered that is because of a university in Hungary, University of Szeged. I can't say that Hungarian word, Szeged. And they discovered this, I believe, in 2017. One of the most significant discoveries in psychedelic science. They discovered that, yes, DMT is a 5-HT receptor agonist, which is a serotonin agonist. And most psychedelics are that agonist. But DMT is also a sigma-1 agonist. And sigma-1, the sigma-1 receptor, is a receptor that has a profile of protecting the body and the brain whenever we have a lack of oxygen. So perhaps the sigma-1 agonism is responsible for this ischemic property that DMT has.
Wow, and I'm not as familiar with the sigma receptors as I am with like the serotonin or the cannabinoid receptors. What else do we know about this system, the sigma system? Like, where are these receptors located? What do they do? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah.
Other than being neuroprotective?
Yeah, so really, we don't really have any other information about sigma-1 receptors aside from the fact that they have ischemic properties. But I do have a bit of a theory when it comes to DMT and its sigma-1 agonism. So DMT, once again, it's the only psychedelic that we have discovered that has this sigma-1 property. Well, what is, as I said, it's a way to sort of protect the body and the brain in the event of a lack of oxygen. That's what it does, and that's what sigma-1 agonism does. Okay, but what if we don't have a sort of stroke, or we're relatively fine? There's no sort of vascular problems. We're good. So what if we sort of overload the body with this protective ability from sigma-1 agonism via DMT? Well, perhaps due to the fact that we've overloaded our brain with a very high intense protection, that this protection may work in the sense of that we have a surplus of survivability. And in this surplus, we create things like entities, beings, aliens, because it's just a surplus of survivability, just, hey, there's other things here, everything's fine. Everything is hyper fine. We're just going to create things to make sure that everything's fine. So it could be that. And it's a theory that I'm actually writing about, and it isn't done yet, but I think that there's something there.
I love that. So maybe our brain like always has the capability to be that creative and that visual, but our brain always has to put so much energy towards protecting itself and being resilient that typically it can't funnel energy in that direction. But when it has that hyper safety net of DMT through those sigma receptors, it's allowed to kind of redirect some of that energy towards other things, whether that's visuals. Do you think fractals are part of the story too, potentially?
So fractals are a definite thing when it comes to DMT, but it's also a thing when it comes to like LSD. Mm-hmm. So I have a theory also. I have a paper that I've written and it's being actually it finished the peer review process. I have to finish the edits, but I have a theory that could tell us why we have fractals with DMT and LSD. So, and I can't get too deep into it.
No worries.
Because it hasn't been published yet. But
yeah,
I can say that perhaps we're looking too closely at the brain when we should be looking at some other part of the body that could have the answers that we desire when it comes to fractals.
Interesting. My guess is the gut, but I'm not going to make you say anything else about your theory.
Hey, I will say this. I'm not going to, but I will say that when it comes to 5-HT receptors, only like 10% are in the brain.
Right.
The other is in the gut. We have so many 5-HT receptors in the gut. So I always say that like psychedelic science, yeah, it's good to be a brain scientist, a neuroscientist, like myself, but also maybe we should have gastrointestinal scientists.
You know, I love that point. We obviously know about the gut-brain axis and how well these are connected. As you're saying, the serotonin receptors are in the gut heavily. The cannabinoid receptors are in the gut heavily. And we kind of just ignore it, although we also know even like how your appetite changes on psychedelics significantly. At least I've experienced that. Your hunger changes. It's definitely all connected, and I think this is also the power of collaboration in research and sciences, and especially in universities, when you can kind of like knock on someone else's door and be like, hey man, you're an expert in this, like, do you mind if we have a quick talk, because I got this new theory and it might blow your mind. But I agree, I think having like gut psychedelic science would be awesome.
It'd be amazing. Yeah, I'm waiting for people out there. If anyone's thinking about getting into psychedelic science, focus on that gut.
I love it. And so you're writing a few theory papers right now, which is awesome, especially in psychedelics, because we do know a lot, but we obviously don't know a lot too. Are these kind of thought of by yourself, with you and your mentor, with you and your colleagues? Like, how does that what's the process of creating a theory paper in psychedelics?
Yeah, so it's essentially I'll have a theory, and I don't present it to my supervisors because it's Kim Cooper's, Jan Raymakers, and Bettina Sorger, like literally the top of the game when it comes to psychedelic science. So I'll have a theory, and I'm like, okay, Zeus, is this theory an actual theory, or is this something that you just like thought of in your bedroom? So I'll like dive deep into it. I'll look, I'll see if there's anything there. And if there's a little bit of action happening, then I'll start writing the paper, and then I'll give a presentation in front of, Kim Cooper's and Jan Raymakers and Bettina Sorger and whoever else, like maybe Natasha Mason is also there, and Samuli, like all these people I'm fortunate enough to be around like the top people in psychedelics. It's amazing. But I'll give a presentation, and I'm like, all right, guys, I have this theory, and they just literally, analytically, surgically break down the theory, how this and that, and this and that, and this and that. And I mean, listen, if you have a thing about criticism, then you won't survive the whole scientific process. I'm just giving, because you already know this. Like you have to be able to have your baby, your theory that you've thought of for a long time, just be crushed and demolished. And you have to reassemble it. You have to have the confidence and the courage to reassemble it better. But they're helping you reassemble it
They're
better.
helping you. Yeah, you got to think of
Yes.
it in the positives of like they're not just ripping it down to say you're dumb. They're ripping it down to say, "Hey, we already actually can fill in some of these gaps," or "Hey, this part doesn't make sense because of this part that we know, but this direction like definitely head in that direction." And then obviously it also helps in like the peer review process so you don't get ripped apart there because they'll do that too. It's always reviewer two. Just saying.
Yeah. Yes. Always reviewer too. Yeah. Except in this most recent theory paper, it was the first reviewer. Anyways, So currently, I have 3 theory papers and 1 study that I started this week, which is also it's introducing another theory to psychedelic science, but it's good to, because the thing is like psychedelic science, it's really not stuck. Okay, it's really sort of centered around how can psychedelics help with maladaptive behavior like anxiety, depression, PTSD, which is a fantastic thing to do. If we could use psychedelics to help people in these sort of conditions or states, it's perfectly fine. But my research really isn't about like helping people. I'm purely perceptual. I focus on perception. I focus on why we actually trip, what is happening when we trip, and can we alter that trip? And that's all I'm focused on. And if my research goes towards that direction of helping people, that's fantastic. But that isn't the aim of my research. It's purely scientific and perceptual. That's it.
Love it. Let's start talking about that then. Let's talk about DMT and VR. In my head, I picture somebody with a big cap on their head and a bunch of thingies tripping on DMT, and you're like monitoring what's going on. But, is it over the eyeballs? Is it like that kind of classic VR type of thing? And I'm just kind of curious about the different iterations that went into this, how it's kind of changed and evolved over time. And then, of course, what metrics you're looking at to try to piece together the visual experience that somebody's experiencing without obviously being behind their eyeballs and being able to experience that. And also how your data matches up with their perceived experience.
Yes, no, listen, I totally understand. It's a pretty wild concept. So really this idea like began in like the end of 2021, but we had to wait until there was tech to even do this. So the thing is think of like a VR headset, they all sort of have these like giant goggles you put on, and then they all strap around the back of the head, right? That's how all VR headsets are. And that's fantastic. They're comfortable, they're cool, but the problem is if you're researching the back of the brain, which is the visual cortex, which is really the sort of end result of a very long visual pathway process of seeing stuff that sort of ends up all right here. If you're trying to place these things called optodes, which is how I look at the brain via functional near-infrared spectroscopy, we place optodes right on the visual cortex. But the problem is, if a VR headset covers the back of the visual cortex, it's basically impossible to look at the visual cortex. So we had to wait and wait. We thought about hacking headsets, and the hacks didn't work out properly. So we waited until April 2023. And that's when HTC released the first ever VR headset that didn't sort of affix itself to the back of the brain. They went on like glasses.
Oh, so nothing was touching the back of your head. Okay.
Nothing was touching the back of the head. And it was fully functional, meaning we could connect it to the computer. We could, run our own programs, our own scripts. Now it was something really enticing to like science. So I had to wait for this headset to be released, and it was released, and we got it. It's really expensive, but it's called the HTC XR Elite.
Did you were you like in contact with anybody who was manufacturing that stuff, or were you kind of just like scouring the internet and like signing up for email updates, just waiting for the perfect headset to come out?
I mean, yeah, I wasn't in contact with anyone. I was just literally on like Reddit boards looking to see how people have hacked headsets, and like no one really was doing this research. So I was trying to do hacks and they didn't work. And then I'm like, then I find that HTC was releasing this XR, VR headset, and it had this functionality, and I'm like, oh my gosh, finally it's happening. Finally, this like wild idea of looking at the brain while in VR and DMT is possible now. So, waited for it to come out. Literally came out April. We got it the end of April, and it's been incredible for our research. It's really the first time we can actually look at the visual cortex in VR ever. Aside from all the DMT and the psychedelics, this is the first time like we've ever been able to look at the visual cortex in VR. So, like, the research that I'm doing could be, like, the first ever glimpse just in the visual cortex with VR, which is kind of cool,
Wow, and of course, you're talking about DMT here, but we can map different psychedelics and really start to understand the differences, comparing and contrasting exactly where in that visual cortex it's being initiated or stimulated.
Yes. So the next step is, I'll just skip a bunch of different steps. I'll get to the fun step. Now, Zeus, how can we possibly see what a person is seeing when they're tripping in the brain? The answer is yes, but slowly we're getting there.
Okay, cool.
But currently, we can see 4 things in the brain and in the actual trip or the experience. Number 1, we can see if a person is tripping or having a visual experience if it's in black and white or in color.
People trip in black and white?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that's, I guess, grids, giant black and white grids, or in a darkness with just white or something.
Wow, amazing!
Yeah.
So you can you see like the level of vibrance is for like the color part, or is it kind of like yes no?
Yes. So we can actually see the amount of like vibrance. Like if a person's having a really vibrant trip, a vibrant experience, we could see the sort of the intensity of the sort of colorful experience a person's having. That's yes, we can see that.
Wow, amazing.
It's wow. I know, it's wow. Number 2, we can see if a person is tripping and they're having a visual experience that's going by really fast, like or it's just like I'm not going by fast. It's sort of static. It's not moving at all. We can see that. Those 2 differences.
Okay, cool.
Number 3, this thing called polar angle mapping, which is basically we could see if a person's having a trip or an experience and they're like, tripping, we could see if the sort of trip is happening in the left side or the right side or the top left, or they're seeing some crazy fractal in the top right, or whatever it is. We can sort of see where a person is experiencing visual information
in their visual field,
in their visual field. Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So theoretically, if a person's head is like static like this, and they're tripping, and they're not, and if they see something at the top of their field of vision, we could see that, or the bottom, we could see that.
Okay, cool.
That's number 3. And number 4, we could see whether a person is seeing a face or if they are not seeing a face.
Whoa! So that's a human face we're talking about, if they're seeing a human face.
Yes, a human face. Any face that resembles a human face. It could be like an alien-looking face with like eyes and nose, but if it has the sort of features of a human, we could see that.
Wow, and you probably can't tell if they like recognize that face, right? It's just like a face or no face.
We can't tell if they recognize the face just yet, but we're like working towards that. There are ways to see if a person is having like a sort of an empathic connection with the face, but that's a little bit further on in the research.
Cool. So that's amazing. Those 4 things. I mean, that tells you a lot about what somebody's experiencing, especially a lot more than we've ever known. I want to keep learning about this, but are you seeing consistency in what people are experiencing? Like, you see most people experience increases in vibrancy, or most people see at least one face, or like, do you see consistency, or is it really based on like that brain and where that person's at in life and all of these other factors?
Yeah, so last year we ran a DMT survey research where we sort of asked hundreds of people to assess their DMT experience, and we were trying to quantify this visual experience with this very extensive scale that we've built to assess a visual experience, not how a trip made you feel, but what you actually see in this trip.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a visual. So we implemented this. We gave it to hundreds of people. I think 600 people, and we got a lot of data back.
Okay.
And so this is the clearest picture we've ever had of the DMT experience, and I can share a bit of it with you. We're still looking at the data right now, but I can share a bit of it with you. So number one, there's 3 things that are pretty consistent with the DMT experience. Number one, it begins like you're just sort of in a place, and then it rapidly, like the environment rapidly changes, and you have this thing we call it locomotive assisted visual experiences, which is basically, let's say you're like flying. If you're flying, let's say you're a superhero and you're flying through like space. Your environment is going to have this sort of streaky property with it, like which gives you it essentially indicates that you're flying. So this property happens quite often and very fast in the beginning of the DMT experience. It's a very consistent thing.
Blasting off, as they say, right?
As they say, yeah. It's blasting off, like number 2, the sort of occurrence of entities, of talking to or being around things or beings or having things appear like they're beings, or you feel that you're in the presence of a being. This is a very consistent thing. One of the highest things that we've also seen too.
So I was going to ask about that too, because the DMT elves are a pretty classic known thing to happen with DMT. Do you think that's kind of what this is referring to, and maybe different people see different forms of these elves, or maybe not? Or is that more of a myth that people hear and then it tricks their brain into expecting that, so then they see it?
Now we're talking. So so listen, whenever I open my mouth about these DMT elves, people love to say, "Oh, Zeus, you're just a rational scientist. You don't know anything about the elves or whatever." Listen, guys, I've written articles. You've probably read my article on Double Blind about DMT elves. Had like 800 comments on their Instagram. Everyone's going crazy. But okay, so what are these elves? What are they Keebler elves? Are they Christmas elves? Or are they culturally assembled constructs that are dependent on a person's geographical or cultural background? Like, is it that? Is it that a person named Terence McKenna, which is a very famous ethnobotanist who popularized the idea of people seeing DMT elves and really gave a lot of people across the planet their first understanding of DMT. Perhaps he gave a huge expectancy effect, which is essentially you prompt a person into thinking that they're going to have something or something's going to happen, and people are seeing or experiencing entities and elves because Terence McKenna, the single most famous person in the DMT space, told people they would see elves and entities.
Well, I think that's a valid discussion. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say it, but I think you're right. I mean, this is like all you hear when you talk about DMT. So obviously it has significant cultural, it's integrated into the entire culture of psychedelics. So
Yeah, no, and once again, yes, I have seen the elves. Everyone asks me that. Oh, Zeus, you haven't seen the elves. You don't understand, bro. I've had conversations with the elves, bro. I've been to hyperspace. We've traveled together without a passport. I've hung out with the elves, but I also understand that I've taken a very powerful psychedelic that is a quintessential serotonergic agonist that has the distinct ability to give a person a visual experience. And I understand how the visual pathway and how the brain and how things like predictive processing works. And honestly, I always say, look, our brain producing elves that we can talk to is probably one of the least interesting things our brains can do. Heck, talk to any, really good book author. They create entire towns, cities, populated with people, with their personalities, entire storylines, entire, series of lineages and generations. That's happening in their head. So the fact that we can create one or two or three little elves to talk to, yeah, talk to any book author. Talk, come on.
Imagination. I love that. And I mean, I was so curious about one other thing. You know how some people have an internal monologue, like your brain's talking to itself, and then some people don't? Do we know anything about the difference in tripping between those types of brains? Because I can't imagine not having a voice inside my head, like fighting with myself constantly and kind of having these discussions. But some people, it's just like, they're like, oh, I just think in color, like, or I just see in shapes. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what is your psychedelic experience like? That must be insane.
Yeah, no. So actually, yeah, you're 100% right. There's actually a disorder, I hate using the word disorder. I only say condition. There's a condition, and there's a condition in which people have an inability to even visually imagine.
Right, so, I know, and it's crazy. Yeah. Like, what does their brain feel like to them? This is something I struggle so much to even imagine because I'm trying to imagine something that they can't imagine.
Yeah, no, it's pretty remarkable. And currently, I have a little theory that says that this condition could also translate in a person not having a visual trip when they do psychedelics.
Oh, so they might trip in a different type of way. Or do you think it's possible for psychedelics to essentially, like, I'm not saying cure, but like regain the ability or allow people to have the ability to have some sort of thing happening in their brain that has never happened before?
So that's a great question. And it depends. It depends on the level of the inability to see something. Like if we're talking about a person that has the sort of inability to visually imagine, perhaps. But if we're talking about a person who's like born blind, like congenital blindness,
right.
What happens? So, for example, matter of fact, there was a study about Sarah Del Arbor in 2018. It was a case report in which she talked to a person that was born blind, and this person took LSD, a substance that is really known to have a visual, sort of visual experience. This person that's born blind took LSD, and he had zero visual experience, zero visual trip at all, none. But he had other trips. He had auditory trips. Wow. He had tactile trips, and you know how blind people or people that are born blind, they in order for a person to see a face, they touch a face. That's a big thing. They touch a face and they can see the fine details, and that's how they see a face. Well, this person that was tripping on LSD, when he touched the face of his friend, he felt, her face was melting, which is like a person taking LSD, looking at a person's face melts. He felt the face melt. So you have the same psychedelic experience experienced by two different sensory modalities, touch and vision.
Wow,
What's
and
that
it's
about?
kind of in so many therapeutic settings of psychedelics, people are blindfolded, right? Like that's kind of part of it sometimes. Do we think that like the reason behind that is to kind of funnel that creativity or that like healing towards the inner self instead of the visual perception of what's going on?
Yeah, no, listen, that's so, guys, if you're out there, just Google psychedelic therapy. And like the first image you're probably going to see is a person lying down on the sofa, blindfolded. That's a thing that happens. And the reason why a lot of therapists do that is because of this one famed therapist. His name is Stanislav Grof. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he's a very famous therapist, and he sort of promoted this idea of blindfolding your eyes because it helps you get to your inner being and all this stuff. And actually, when we hung out in Vermont, I had a conversation with some guys from MAPS about this process. And I said, look, okay, this is what you guys are doing, but you're also putting on headphones and you're giving them a playlist to listen to, but you're trying to guide the visual system with auditory input, which is kind of weird. Perhaps we should be covering the ears and giving people visual information, visual input in order to guide their visual trip, which is by research.
Which brings us back to VR.
Which brings us back.
Oh, that's awesome. I agree with that. I've actually always been kind of apprehensive about that type of psychedelic therapy because I didn't really believe in the blindfolding aspect. But I am not the expert here, so I'm not going to publicly be like, I don't think that's a good idea. Like somebody like you is definitely an expert in this space. So that's a really interesting perspective. And I'm sure this also kind of depends on someone's experience and why they're using psychedelics, and that's, and kind of what we need to kind of curate to make them feel comfortable and to bring out the right things. But I think that's super interesting. One more question about this survey with 600 people. Did you use those survey results to help guide the research to where to look into the visual cortex? Like if everyone's saying, I see entities with faces, I see very vibrant colors, blah, blah, blah. Are you using the data from that survey and then bringing that to the VR study to say, okay, we know these things are happening and we know where this is happening in the brain, so we're going to focus our efforts on those areas?
Yeah, so absolutely. And, really the way that we did it is that, of course, certain things happen that are sort of consistent with the whole experience, but the inverse is that a lot of things don't happen. Or don't happen often, which is great because we could really take out a lot of the visual cortex, which is a very complex, cortical region. And it helps us, it guides us into really, our important regions of interest, our ROIs, which is the areas of the brain that we do look at when people have these, very intense experiences. So yes, it has guided us to even build VR applications, and also how to do it, what to put in it, and where to look at the brain whenever we do it.
Awesome. Let's keep talking about this VR experience because, one, I want to picture it in my head, but two, I just want to, understand it better. And I also, you clearly mentioned that you can't have anything in the back of your head because this is where the visual cortex is. Do you have a probe, something physically touching the back of their head? I'm picturing someone in the Matrix, on a bed with the things attached. But what is that physical setup like?
So that's a great question. So we use this relatively new brain imaging tech or device called functional near infrared spectroscopy. And what is that? It's fantastic. So with things like fMRI, which you've definitely heard of, it's a way to look at the brain via magnetism. So essentially, you're looking at the magnetism from the iron in the blood, basically, which is pretty wild, you know. And based on the iron concentrations in the blood, you could tell what's happening in the brain.
Like where the blood is flowing to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, based on the iron concentrations, which is fantastic. And that's great technology. We can get really deep into the brain. And there's like EEG, which looks at the electrical signals of the brain, which is also a very important thing, but very old technology too, over 100 years old. fNIRS is pretty remarkable, and it's really relatively brand new. There's only been like a couple, I think there's like one study or like a couple studies with fNIRS. No, there's one study with fNIRS and psychedelics, and like I'll have the second one basically, which is pretty remarkable.
So cool.
What is so dope? So how does it look at the brain? So this is wild. So you place these little optodes, which is like a little phaser gun, on your head. You have like little areas. You have a cap because you want to have the areas of the brain sort of mapped. So you place these optodes in this cap. They're about this big. They're like little phaser guns, and they shoot photons of light, basically. And it's a source and a detector. So a source and a detector. A source shoots the photon of light in the brain, and the detector detects it. And that's happening across the brain. So what happens? How does it detect brain activity? Well, based on if your blood in the brain has oxygen, or if it doesn't have oxygen, the photons of light bounce differently off the blood in your brain that has oxygen based on the blood in your brain that doesn't have oxygen.
Wow. Oh my gosh. This is like blowing my mind because everything I've ever known about this was fMRI, and it's like, that's cool. But this is completely different in like a magnitude of different ways. This is so intriguing, and I can't wait to read your publications. I hope there's a little diagram in there because I definitely want to see that. But this is amazing. So it has to do with oxygenated blood, showing that that's where your body's pushing the newly oxygenated blood to the visual cortex in these specific regions.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So they have a cap on. They have like a hat.
Yeah, so they have a cap on. Yeah, they have a cap on, and these little little phaser guns, little photon guns, are shooting photons of light. And it isn't an invasive process. Like there isn't anything puncturing your head. There's no like weird things like inserted into your brain, which is fantastic because near infrared light can penetrate pretty deep within the brain. It's pretty impressive what it does. But the limitation is that we can't go really deep in the brain. We can't go down to like the thalamus and see the thalamus with like clarity. But the thing about fNIRS is that we have a really good spatial precision, which is basically we can see where activity is happening, and we have really good temporal precision, which means that we can see when this activity is happening, which is very, very important, especially when you have something that's a fast-acting substance like DMT, which really the onset is within seconds. You really want to see when that onset is happening.
Wow. Okay, amazing. So they have this cap on. They have these visual goggles on. And then you, as the researcher, are obviously measuring the stuff coming out of the cap, but you've also curated and designed what they're seeing through that visual experience. So what are they seeing in these VR goggles?
Yeah, that's the question that every single lab on the planet wants to know. I see you, University of Zurich. I see you, Imperial College London, trying to talk to me on my emails. Listen, I can't.
I can't tell you that.
I can't tell you what they're seeing until it's published, but I can tell you what they aren't seeing.
Amazing. Let's talk about that.
And they aren't seeing these obvious psychedelic YouTube visuals of like mandalas and all this stuff and all these weird. They're not seeing that. It's not that. We aren't like dropping a YouTube video with all these like panthers floating in outer space with wings turning into flowers and all this stuff that we've seen. We're not doing that. We aren't doing that. So because that doesn't give us anything. We can't get anything from that. We aren't trying to recreate the psychedelic experience. We're trying to augment and modulate the psychedelic experience. So what we show people is very calculated, very determined based on a lot of ocular science, a lot of neuroscience, and a lot of colloquial understanding of the DMT experience. And also, we have, once again, 600 plus data points of DMT experiences across the world. So we have like the biggest data set of DMT experiences. And I'm working with people like Bettina Sorger, which is like, she was one of the first people to ever do brain computer interface like on the planet. So we aren't showing people cheesy, psychedelic things that you would see in posters and like head shops. It's not that.
Can I ask another question? I don't know if you don't want to answer this, you don't have to. Are the things people are seeing real? Like, do these things exist in our world, or are they created virtually?
So, I can say that with the ability of the HTC XR Elite, it's beyond a VR headset. So XR means extended reality, which means it's not just a virtual reality. We could have a person looking at their reality, at what they're seeing in front of them, and we can also add things to their reality. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask any more questions, but I don't want you to accidentally say something, and I don't want anyone to get in trouble for this. So the goal here is to obviously learn and research the visual perception during a DMT trip. Would the goal also be to eventually implement this VR for people who are taking DMT in a therapeutic setting to curate that experience, because you've done research to know what provides people with I know you don't do therapeutic stuff, but like even comfortability or even like brain expansion, like is that kind of the goal? Or are you sticking specifically to understanding what's happening in the visual cortex during a DMT trip?
So a little bit of everything. And the reason why I say that is because if you approach science with the desired outcome of like, I want this to help people, then perhaps there's a certain bias that goes into what you're doing and your results. But if you go into something with just the sort of pursuit to understand it, then in this understanding, it could be applied to therapeutic, or it could be a way to give a person a really, sort of different reality, or extend a person's reality. So in order for us to even go to those points of, and yes, it could be that I could be on the verge of, changing the face of psychedelic therapy with visual inputs as opposed to the auditory sort of playlist that you see in people being blindfolded. Yes, it could. Those pictures that you see when you search for psychedelic therapy could be VR headsets as opposed to blindfolds. That could happen. But I'm going into this, and we have been going into this, not with that intention.
Okay.
Yeah.
It makes sense. But I love just keeping research in the form of curiosity, because honestly, a lot of times with grant funding, you kind of can't be that curious because you have to like fit those deliverables. So unless you're in a well-funded lab, like you have a threshold of creativity and exploration sometimes, at least during normal work hours. Sorry, go ahead.
No, listen, you hit it directly on the head. Like, I mean, Maastricht University, like the lab that I'm in, listen, I couldn't do this research anywhere else on the planet. To give people DMT, number one, to give a person any psychedelic, most psychedelic research is based on animal models across America, especially across the entire world. So first off, to give people a psychedelic is very difficult. And then to give people a psychedelic without any clinical pursuit or outcome is like, what is even happening? Listen, the Maastricht University in the Netherlands, I wake up every single day, Riley. I cannot believe that I have this amazing opportunity and the freedom to research DMT and the visual cortex without any pharmaceutical outcome or any clinical outcome or any, whatever.
It's amazing. So are you from Cali and then you moved there for grad school? Was that kind of your process there?
Yeah, so listen, I had a great life in Los Angeles. I was partying, doing my thing, having a great time, living that California lifestyle. And you already understand what it is. Cannabis is one of the best one of the best places to buy cannabis in the world, the everything. But this opportunity is something that was undeniable. To number one, to get my PhD in neuroscience was amazing. But to do this,
unbelievable.
So it was something that I had to just stop everything and just go towards this pursuit, and that's what I've been doing since 2022.
Oh, amazing. And is that, I'm not calling it lax because I'm sure there's so much that goes into actually being able to do this research, but is that mentality also present in the culture of where you are, not just in the university, but is the kind of freedom to explore psychedelics and yourself and all of this, is this kind of translatable to that culture that you live in now?
I mean, the Netherlands, look, first off, before cannabis was even legal in California, cannabis was legal right here. The idea of coffee shops were everywhere. Like, before you could go into, like, a dispensary in California and get your bud, they had it over here. Coffee shops, space cakes is what they call the edibles. So the culture of exploration with psychoactive substances has been instilled in the Netherlands for a very long time, and and the thing is that this country, it's remarkable. Like there's like revolutionary things like assisted death therapy, which is having the freedom to choose when you want to die, which is like actually a pretty liberating thing.
That should be a fundamental right, like everywhere. Yeah. Do you think the mentality there is because we haven't had that level of government propaganda for these substances and they actually listen to research?
Yes. So, I mean, look, the Netherlands has a long history of dropping some dope science, whether it's physics, whether it's biology, whether it's chemistry. This is a very science-oriented country, and so are the surrounding countries like Germany, like Belgium. Oh, yeah. So it's really instilled. But also, like, when it comes to like just getting psychedelics here, I don't want to give too many secrets away, but it's really easy to go on websites, order any psychedelic you want, even psychedelics that are just exotic, like 2CE or 5-MAPB or 6-APB, all these different psychedelics that you only hear about in like Shogun's books or, whatever. You can just order them and it'll get delivered to your house in like 24 hours with a receipt and a sticker to put on your door. That's the level. God. Yeah, so it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild.
Man, that's awesome. Thank you for explaining that. That makes me really jealous for your lifestyle, but we won't harp on that. I wanted to kind of bring our brains back. I tend to get derailed a little bit here, but bringing our brains back to VR, I can see, like, I know this is not the goal of your research, but set and setting are obviously so important for so many psychedelics, and so many people prefer to do many psychedelics in nature. And I can see VR being kind of like an accessible way of experiencing nature during a psychedelic trip, whether you live somewhere that's like very far away or, you don't want to physically drive somewhere to get to nature to do those psychedelics and come back. So I feel like as somebody who loves spending time in nature, there might be some future things there, but also as somebody who's also done VR, sometimes if you're like in, for lack of better words, a shitty place and you put on your VR thing and then you have this awesome experience and then you take them off and you're like, oh my God, like it looks so much worse when you take off the VR headset. And I don't know if that's something you've experienced with any of your research where people take off the VR and they're like, oh, I don't want to be in reality anymore. Is that like a real phenomenon?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about VR is that, so yeah, you really hit it right on the head. Psychedelics are so dependent on the setting in which a person takes the psychedelic. So the environment a person takes the psychedelic, if it's a very comfortable environment, if it's a safe environment, if it's a familiar environment, or if you're on the, hit the hill, the cliff of some mountain, that's also cool. But the thing is like VR, you can really like change the setting to whatever you want. And you can even change the settings to settings that don't even exist in reality. Or you could be on a spaceship floating to like Alpha Centauri galaxy. Or, you could go back in time to the Byzantine Empire and take shrooms on a hilltop while you watch, an entire civilization flourish. The settings can be whatever you want. So really, if setting is such an important thing in the outcome of a psychedelic, and if VR can extend these settings, then by definition, VR can extend or expand a psychedelic experience to a boundary that's bigger than what we initially thought, which is amazing.
Wow. Well, the options are endless. My brain,
yes.
I need to, consciously practice it, thinking of where I would be, where my, dream psychedelic trip area would be in VR. I also, my brain also thinks, yeah, you could curate a really beautiful, amazing, powerful healing experience with VR. You could also probably curate, the worst trip in the world through VR, which I'm not trying to say people should do this, but I feel like that could be a form of mind control in the future. But that's probably a negative headspace to be in. So we'll move on. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You have these cool glasses on, and something I am so passionate about that nobody understands is how lighting plays such a substantial role, obviously during a trip, but in general, big lights are the most triggering, most terrible thing in the world, whereas soft lighting is really beautiful. Is that also something that you kind of curate in this experience, is the level of lighting that somebody's experiencing in their eyeballs?
Absolutely. Lighting is so important in an actual psychedelic experience. And with VR, you can change the light settings to really whatever you want. And so, yes, and it's lighting is very important. And also the actual origin of where the light is coming from. Whether light is coming from behind you, if it's coming underneath you, or if it's coming from within you.
Ooh.
Which is something that you could do with VR. Little teaser as to what we may be doing in our lab.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, this is, again, I'm not going to ask too many specific questions there. Do you see differences with how women versus men react to DMT or other psychedelics and what they see visually?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in our DMT survey research, we actually asked if people or men, women, or they don't identify, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, that it was mostly populated with guys, men, and based on this, not a lot of women do DMT, and then you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Is that something that Is it based on sociological structures? Is it based on, safety, in the sense that DMT is a psychedelic in which you really lose all aspects of monitoring your reality, and perhaps women have a very strong ability to monitor their reality because there's so many crazy weirdos out there that women have to really be able to monitor their reality just as a self-protective mechanism with all these.
Constantly. Women always know what's going on, or at least a lot of women always know what's going on, because you have to be hyper vigilant literally all the time. And also I think that's why it's I typically do psychedelics with my girlfriends, because all of us just feel comfortable. If you're talking about your past experiences, if you're talking about these really deep emotions, I have friends that have given birth and have had absolutely traumatic experiences, and it's in that setting, in that type of setting, you want friends that you can cry in front of, you can talk about these experiences, you can talk about. And I'm not saying I don't trip with men. I do that too. But for these heavily curated, emotionally healing experiences, almost always a group of women.
Yeah, I understand, because there's a lot of freaking weirdos out there, guys. And yeah, we have to do better. Guys, you got to do better, guys. Stop being weird and bizarre and creepy, dude. Just vibe, bro.
Yeah, 100%. Another question I have as a cannabis research scientist is, do we have any idea how cannabis affects other psychedelics? Because from personal experience and everyone I've ever done psychedelics with or spoke about psychedelics, cannabis is almost always involved. It's somewhere in that journey. And maybe DMT is a little different because it's such a powerful, quick, rapid thing. But how is cannabis involved in this? At least from your either personal experience or research. What do you think?
I mean, it seems like cannabis is always the seasoning on top of psychedelics. Yeah. You just drop a little bit of a blunt or a joint or a bong hit, and it sort of seasons the psychedelics. But in regards to how cannabis modulates psychedelics, we really don't have data to show. I mean, if you're asking me, then yes, it does. But I can't prove that in the lab because we don't have any scientific studies that look at that.
Yeah.
But I mean, and obviously you've smoked cannabis and at the end or the beginning or the peak, and perhaps cannabis modulates these psychedelic experiences. It does for me.
Oh, I 100% think it does. And even at a receptor level, and this is all theory. There's no papers I'm going to cite here, but just from my experience is I have a relatively high tolerance to cannabis. I'm a daily cannabis user, right? But when I do LSD, when I do mushrooms, when I do a lot of these psychedelics, I can chain smoke joints. I'm not even I will never get to the point of feeling overwhelmingly high. The ceiling does not exist on psychedelics. And I'm curious what that means from a receptor level. How is that threshold not reached?
So I'm going to ask you a question as a fantastic cannabis scientist, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm asking you, there is, I believe this is correct, but there is 5-HT receptor agonism with cannabis, correct?
Yes, with CBD specifically. CBD is kind of a weird molecule. It's so promiscuous. It can bind to so many different receptors. It kind of sort of binds to so many different things. This has been part of my theory for sure, but it has to involve the CB1 receptor because that's typically the receptor that THC binds to and makes you feel high, and also typically where you feel that overwhelmed feeling when that receptor is kind of flooded with THC, and you do reach that threshold of being oh, if I take another puff of this, I'm going to have a panic attack and feel way too high. So it's it's almost like the checks and balances system, something changes there where you don't reach that threshold. Maybe your receptors are still, full of THC, but something downstream of that is inhibited from happening, from firing in your brain, so you never reach that sense of panic. And maybe also this is my experience, and this is the experience of just people that I hang out with who use significantly more cannabis than a lot of other people. So maybe it also has to do with your tolerance, and maybe people who don't have that tolerance don't experience that. I don't know. Oh my God, this episode just gave me the best working theory for what I think is going on in our brains during the psychedelic and cannabis experience combined. I'm going to keep that a secret for now, but I'm obviously going to email Zeus because what he says later on in this episode helps me develop this theory. But anyway, I also wanted to say that yes, CBD absolutely does have activity on the 5-HT1A receptors, but also CBG has activity on the 5-HT1 receptor, but in a slightly different way. So CBD acts as an agonist, meaning it's able to activate this receptor, but CBG actually acts as a neutral antagonist, meaning it's able to block both agonists and inverse agonists. So then the question is, does taking CBG with CBD kind of cancel out the effects? And science says likely, but we're not fully sure. And just to clarify here, specifically CBD and CBG both have activity on the 5-HT1A serotonin receptor, not to be confused with the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors that are heavily involved in the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, that's why we have to put a bunch of cash towards cannabis and psychedelic scientists. Come on, people that have money. Come on, billionaires. Come on, Bezos and all these guys with tons of cash. Just drop us some money and we'll do the research. We'll do the research. Just give us the funding.
Yeah, 100%. And we'll do them in the Netherlands because I want to do this research there, not here.
Yeah. You got to come out here and take a tour of the lab. I think you'd really like it.
Oh, like now I really want to, and you can give me these secret websites and I can make a whole trip out of it. It sounds amazing.
Easily.
Okay. We're going to start to wrap up so I don't take too much of your time here. But wanted to ask you, whether it's at your university or other universities, what other psychedelic research are you most stoked about that's happening right now?
Yeah, no. I mean, I gotta give us props. Maastricht University, we're doing some really dope research. So I'll give you a few of the studies that we're currently doing. We actually have a researcher that joined us from Germany, Kat. She is a researcher in synthetic cannabis.
Oh, cool.
And she's looking at the effects of synthetic cannabis via fMRI.
When you say synthetic cannabis, do you mean like a Delta 8 and HHC, or do you mean like the more
spicy variety?
Okay, more spicy. Okay.
Yeah. Not going too deeper into what, but the more spicy variety.
Okay.
But she's looking, deep in the brain with fMRI. We're using a very huge fMRI machine, so we're getting some interesting data from that. I'm excited to see what we find out about that. And then we're also doing the first ever research into this one psychedelic called 3-MMC. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before.
I have not heard of that.
Yeah, it's really popular out here in Europe, and it's sort of like an MDMA psychedelic with a little sprinkle of like a cocaine effect, like a sort of stimulant effect.
That sounds amazing. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, it's great for festivals, but we're also doing that research, and then we have Natasha Mason, who's really pioneering the field of how psychedelics affect glutamate and how glutamate is also released in the body whenever we do psychedelics. He's really really crushing the game when it comes to that. Then we have this other guy, Pablo Mallaroni, who is just diving deep into full brain-wide assessments of psychedelics via lots of different coding and scripting and algorithms. And he also did the first ever 2CB study. He did that last year. So, I mean, we're doing some wild stuff here, and I can keep on going on. We have Alina. She's looking at psychedelics in ADHD, which we're getting some really good data that shows that perhaps psychedelics may actually treat ADHD, which is like, oh my gosh. And we have this other guy from Finland, Samuli, who gave a talk in Berlin last year, had talk of the entire conference. He basically, it's going to sound provocative, but he wants to give kids MDMA. And the reason why is because in comparison to like Prozacs and all these other SSRIs, the sort of, bad effects, the after effects of Prozacs and all these other things are really, really bad compared to MDMA, which doesn't have these bad after effects, and the results are better than Prozac. So theoretically, he's like, let's just give kids MDMA or adolescents.
That makes sense to me. I always thought it was very strange how many like drugs we've been giving these adolescents when their brains are still developing, and then they're supposed to be on them for like the next 15 years with no adverse effects. Yeah. I've never understood, especially like stimulants like Adderall. Like I've always wondered what that's all about. So cool. And if any of these people ever want to get their research out, hook me up, because I want them to come on here and talk about it, because that sounds amazing.
For sure.
I had a question from one of the members of my Patreon who wants to remain anonymous, but their question was, what is the therapeutic dose of DMT, or do we know, or does it differ from person to person?
So shout out to the person that asked that question from your Patreon. And the real answer is we don't know. We don't really know. We haven't, like, when it comes to psychedelics that have been researched in history, the DMT is, we don't have a lot of data to give you an answer that I would feel safe to, tell a person to do this. I don't feel safe telling you what the dosage should be clinically because we don't have enough data.
Right.
So
can you say what dose you use in your studies and your experiments? You don't have to. You do not have to.
If I tell you the dose, then it would give how we're applying the DMT, and that's also important.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, you don't need to divulge anything that you don't feel comfortable, so we can also just move on.
But in a very safe sense, start low. That's the best way.
I was just going to say, in general, with any psychedelic, like start low and go slow. And I actually think that's why those vape pens are a really great place to start. Because you can just take a puff off of a vape pen. There's literally no way you're going to overdo it with a puff off of a vape pen. And because DMT is so fast acting, you can literally just wait it out and be like, okay, that wasn't enough, or that was too much, or, whatever. You can titrate your dose with vape pens so well.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. How do people keep up with your research? Follow you? I follow you on TikTok now. That's rad. I love your vlogs. How do other people kind of stay up to date with what you're doing?
Yeah, so I just hopped on TikTok, which it's a pretty cool platform. Lots of cool content. It's fun, yeah. So I'm still sort of early on TikTok, which is cool. I love the idea of having it. But if you want to follow me, it's very simple. So my Twitter, or X, sorry, Elon. My Twitter is Tipado. That is my surname is what they call it in Europe. So Tipado, and that's on Instagram, Tipado, and also TikTok, Tipado. And if you want to see all of my research, go to tipado.com, Tipado.com. Tipado.com or Tipado, all social medias. Look at my stuff. Also, if you follow me on Instagram, and you're right, I give a little Instagram reel every single day of my work and my research life. So check it out. Why not?
That's rad. I love that you're sharing that component about it. You do so many like cool things that I love following along. I think other people will too. So I don't think people can mess up the name after that wonderful demonstration of where to find you. So anything else you want to say before we end this episode? But I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I loved talking to you. I learned a lot, and I think a lot of people will as well.
I do want to say I really love how you give science, how you communicate science, Riley. I love it. I think you're fantastic at it, and my only regret is that we didn't hang as often as I wanted to when we were in Vermont. I wish we'd have hung the entire time. You're a fantastic person, a fantastic science communicator, and I can't wait to see what you do with your science.
Hey, thanks. Also, can I just tell you that Vermont experience, like I know, after the conference, you went to that party, which was awesome. We almost went to that, but I previously had a really horrible experience with MDMA, like when I was in high school, and I literally almost died on the drug because it wasn't MDMA. It was something else with MDMA. And I had terrible lockjaw, and then I got really sick, like vomiting, but I couldn't open my mouth. It was not a good experience. And actually, during that conference, I had the opportunity to try MDMA again, but in I would call it a therapeutic setting, because we were in this gorgeous hotel room. We had amazing sensory, the carpet. We had a fireplace. We had these amazing sheets, and some of the people I trust the most. Shout out to LP, shout out to Liz. But people I trust the most, and that experience completely changed my perception of this. Completely changed my perception of MDMA, and it was so cool. And that's how I remember that conference so well, is this completely transformative experience with MDMA. So that was how I remember it. But I obviously remember you from that too. But that Vermont experience was so healing for me. And are you gonna go this year?
Yeah. I mean, if I'm invited, I would love to keep on talking about research. It was a great experience, great venue, by the way. Shout out to Rick from putting that together with Soul Equinox. I mean, that was one of the best
Vermont.
conferences. Yeah, Stowe, Vermont, man. Shout out to Stowe, Vermont. Good people, good food, good experience.
It was awesome. And also, the only psychedelic conference ever that was close to my house, because I live in the mountains in New Hampshire. So that was actually the most convenient conference ever for me. Usually I have to fly to a different state, a different country, something crazy. But that was a pretty rad experience on a local level for me.
Hope it happens again. And if it does happen again, we're definitely hanging out and kicking it.
Yeah, I'm ready to party this year if we do. So that's awesome. But thanks again for being on, and I'm sure we'll be in contact in the future. But mad love. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Much love. This was fun.